This is Cynthia Sue Larson with RealityShifters.com, and today talking with you about choosing a positive future for humanity and really envisioning it. So looking at something that we want to create instead of something that may just be happening to us. The inspiration for this video and the companion blog that I put together is that this seems to me to be a perfect time for reclaiming humanity's wisdom and doing so with the goal that this will be an alternative to transhumanism. And I'll get into transhumanism in a minute, but what prompted all this, why I got interested today to put this video together, is that just this last week I saw a post by Dr. Robert Malone, and he had a brilliant question. He was just wondering if the dark World Economic Forum globalist transhuman future dystopia, is that inevitable? Well, goodness, I hope not. I mean, there have been Indigenous First Nations people hoping that this would not be the case before there was the name transhumanism, actually. And so that's I want to get into the reasons I'm so excited about that question. And I do share Dr. Malone's concern with regard to the possible nightmarish future for all of humanity. It does sometimes look like we're headed that way. And the way that Dr. Malone phrases it, he says, as we begin to emerge from the tunnel of the COVID crisis and all of the biowarfare, the WHO, the WEF, and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, he says, mismanagement has caused so much damage. We are being presented with the Great Reset, that I'm sure you've heard of that in the book. The vision of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, transhumanism, and a new class structure of physicals, virtuals, machines, and the Davos man. So it's this, which is being globally pitched by the World Economic Forum and its acolytes as the inevitable outcome. Okay, that may be so. But secondly, the reason I wanted to talk about this is because one of the sources looking at an alternative and what we might be doing, Dr. Malone referenced Christopher Michael Langan. And he is a colleague of mine who he graced several events that I helped to coordinate and organize for Foundations of Mind. Both of us, for example, presented papers at the 2017 conference where Langan presented his paper that was mentioned by Dr. Malone this last week. And it's called Meta-Religion in the Human Singularity. And in this paper, the reason it's so significant to me personally, and it's not something particularly that Dr. Malone pointed out, but I'd like to point it out. Here's what Christopher Michael Langan says. Man requires a valid interpretation of the human individual in society and of the individual and society in reality at large. This interpretation must take the form of an unbroken correspondence, which spans the extended relationship between man as an inhabitant of reality and reality in its most basic and universal form. Man must see himself as an integral part of reality, as an extension of his own being within a single unified ontology or metaphysics. In short, man and reality must share a common metaphysical identity. Okay, that's a big idea, and it's sort of the core crux of the paper that Langan put together on meta-religion. I haven't really gone into what this transhumanism is, but I think a lot of us by this point are starting to see it writing on the wall. But I'll get to that in a minute. Thirdly, the third reason I wanted to do this video and talk about it is because the call to action of finding some kind of common metaphysical identity for man and reality, that's what Langan's talking about, is one that I've taken to heart and I've been working on. In fact, back in October 2020, I began writing articles and giving presentations and interviews about a possible positive vision for humanity that I referenced and started referring to as Revhumanism. And I discussed Revhumanism on Gaia TV with Regina Meredith. That was on an episode of Open Minds with Regina Meredith. And I presented Revhumanism as an essential alternative to transhumanism that is of critical importance for humanity at this time. And what is this Revhumanism? Okay, now we get to the juicy stuff. Okay, and I'll talk about transhumanism too, because actually, when humanity makes this choice between transhumanism, which is becoming perhaps a better version of ourselves, that's what Julian Huxley proposed back in 1927, And his belief was the human species can, if it wishes, transcend itself. And something, we talk about hacking and biohacking and all that. So I think most of us, even if you don't know what they're doing with all these devices and technologies, it's clear that some people are really up to something. They're trying to improve humans. So that's one approach. Not the one that I would recommend personally, not something I'm for. But it's something that people, at least they can see it, so people, the technologists, can lock onto that as a target and start trying to move that direction. That transhumanism, of course, is being pushed by big tech and by the World Economic Forum. And it's an alternative to the metaphysics that currently seem so much more nebulous and unclear to most people, to the point that it's something akin to the road not taken, if you remember that poem. It's beautiful. And there's a line in Robert Frost's poem by the same name, The Road Not Taken, where he refers to a road that's grassy and wanted wear. And so I think some of us might feel that way about these other alternatives that are more spiritual, as Langan is talking about, metaphysical perhaps even. And at this time when there's such a clamor to upgrade to ever newer gadgetry and technology, so much pressure to comply with new medical procedures and technology, and the ever-increasing evidence that the rights of the many could be trampled by the power wielded by a few, that road not taken is starting to seem better and better to a lot of us. Now, fortunately for mankind, some have kept the road not taken in their hearts. And there are even some people who've walked this beautiful path consistently, despite tremendous pressure to be assimilated by more modern ways. Fortunately, there still exists a philosophy of harmoniously coexisting and living and co-creating with a living, developing cosmos, with reverence for the earth and other beings. And this is where Revhumanism comes in. It's just a word to give a name to something that's already there. It basically involves relating with reverence, humility, and empathy with others, with the earth, and with the cosmos, inviting us to actuate high-level sovereign agency. So these principles can be considered to be central parts of a life-centered alternative to transhumanism. When pondering what to call such a life-positive alternative, Revhumanism comes to mind because Rev also stands for reverence. It stands for reviving, regaining, recalling, and growing strong and young again in the Latin. And then I like that feeling of reverence that you can also see. And all of these qualities encourage us, inspire us to live up to the true human highest potential of seeing and respecting the earth and all of creation. And Revhumanism thus invites humans to honor the earth, one another, and recognize the beauty of nature. So sovereignty is a key concept in Revhumanism. And that awareness of incarnational spirituality is the core of that, recognizing our sense of living our life with purpose and for some reason, not just meaningless automatons in some mechanistic universe based on pure information and bits and bytes. All of that is the direction that the material realists would have us go, because that's what you can measure. Those are markers that can be looked at. But is that ever what we really feel like we are? Is that what I feel like I am? I can assure you it's not. I'm definitely much more than any information summary of my life, including all the measurables. I'm definitely much more. I do have a feeling of purpose and meaning. So if we are not automatons just existing as a sort of machine components, then clearly we can be something much bigger. This is where I'd like to talk about something I've just discussed before, and it happened that back in 1992, the Fetzer Institute hosted and sponsored one of the highest level intellectual conferences ever held between the First Nations people of the American continent, including Leroy Little Bear, Blackfoot, and also, I believe, Harvard educated and received a diploma from there, together with quantum physicists, including Dr. David Bohm, who's one of the physicists who came up with an interpretation for quantum physics. So it's the Bohmian approach, the holographic interpretation. And then, of course, field-experienced linguists. Now, this is where they come in, is with the goal of translating the concepts between the indigenous and Western scientific worldviews and finding a unified area of agreement, which they did. And so they basically were put together in some points of serious agreement that were crafted by Dan Moonhawk Alford. He was the linguist that was definitely putting things together and documenting it afterward. And these points are: everything that exists vibrates. Everything is in flux. The part enfolds the whole, not just the whole is more than the sum of its parts. There is an implicate order to the universe. The ecosphere is basically friendly. Nature can be taught new tricks. Quantum potential and spirit mean something similar. And the principle of complementarity supersedes dualities. And that means that you can say yes to two things, and that just because you said yes to one of them doesn't mean you've ruled out the other one. It's a whole different way of respecting, maybe intersecting ideas and concepts and worldviews, and actually everything. Sort of the true nature of everything is that way to its core. And I've discussed that with quantum logic previously. Okay, so one of the most important discoveries at this intersection of linguistics, Native America, quantum physics, and consciousness was the realization that there can exist a kind of common metaphysical identity shared by man and reality. And this is along the lines that we heard Christopher Michael Langan was calling for. He was asking for it. Dan Moonhawk Alford pointed out the realization that Benjamin Lee Whorf made of the way human thinking can be influenced by language. And that's when you consider verb-dominated languages, such as most Native American languages. Now, I met Dan Moonhawk Alford. I consider him a great human being and someone that was a great source of inspiration and motivation to me. And here's what Moonhawk wrote about this coming together of great minds back at the Fetzer Institute in 1992. Whereas every sentence in English must properly have a subject, a noun or noun phrase, and a verb, many, if not most, Native American languages can have sentences with no nouns at all. And I'm going to hope to pronounce this Repi, a full sentence in Hopi, referring to a celestial event, means flashed, when we have to say the lightning flashed. But this goes much further. Sakeja says that when he's speaking at Mi'kmaq back on the reserve, he can go all day long without ever uttering a single noun. This statement is mind-boggling to most English speakers. So much of our facts and knowledge are wrapped up in nouns. So what would all that knowledge look like in a language that doesn't have nouns in the same way? This includes all concepts all the way to God. And so here are Dan Moonhawk Alford. He's riffing on concepts that Benjamin Lee Whorf put together, some of which I think were crafted and created when he was talking with some physicists. So these ideas have been bouncing around between physicists, scientists, and linguists, philosophers for quite some time. I want to add something that Leroy Littlebear added, and he's the Canadian Blackfoot elder who was one of the first most instrumental people in putting together what turned into Language of Spirit, Bohemian Dialogues, hosted by Seed University, and Glenn Aparicio Perry, and Leon Secatero, and lots of people. But here's what Leroy Littlebear said. Aboriginal peoples are forever explaining themselves to non-Aboriginal people, telling their stories, explaining their beliefs and ceremonies, and introducing ideas that have never crossed the non-Aboriginal mind. Western knowledge operates from a linear, singular view. It views the world from order beneath chaos. It is very noun-oriented. Knowledge is about oneself in relation to everything else, in a relativistic sense. Aboriginal knowledge has a very different coming to know. It is holistic and cyclical, like cycles of nature and seasons and so forth. It views the world from chaos, underneath order. Its languages are process and action-oriented. Knowledge is about participation in and with the natural world. That was words of wisdom from Leroy Littlebear, who I greatly respect, and I was fortunate and blessed to be part of the inner circle of one of those Language of Spirit conferences, the dialogues, back when they were happening. But getting back to our topic of Revhumanism. Revhumanism acknowledges that humanity is part of a living, growing cosmos, with everyone intrinsically interconnected with a transcendent divine nature. We're not poor things, as some people might say to someone else, like, oh, you're sick, you poor thing. We are not poor things. We're not things. We are divine beings. We have meaning, we have purpose, we have an internal sense of sanctity of our inner light, of our source. Revhumanism invites us to live true to this highest potential of embodying more wisdom than cleverness, more hope than cynicism, more humility than hubris, more empathy than apathy, and more reverence than insolence. Revhumanism represents a radical invitation for each of us to be the highest level embodiment of consciousness we wish to see in the world. When we see everyone and everything from the perspective of reverence, doors to adjacent possible realities open where there were no doors before. And this is the key idea. So we now have that wonderful opportunity. You know I love to ask that question, how good can it get? Now we can add that on to how good can it get when we see ourselves as an integral part of reality, and reality as an extension of our own being. Until next time, this is Cynthia Sue Larson with realityshifters.com. Love you so much. Take care.